I have a very peculiar job, and I think it's very peculiar that I'm sitting on a panel talking about competition. It's perhaps useful to think of the CPUC as a financing structure for infrastructure, particularly centralized infrastructure. And so a good example is our early days as the Railroad Commission, where it became clear that you had competition between rail providers to big markets, but no service elsewhere in the state of California. And there were so many people competing for transportation services between LA and San Francisco, for example, that everybody was going bankrupt. So the solution was to create an agency that awarded a franchise to one single operator and then made sure that they were charging fair rates that didn't gouge, but that actually made sure that investors were sure that they would be paid back. And so we do that by setting those rates at the cost of the infrastructure plus a fair return. And so when the electric industry started to come along and the telecom industry came along, they said, that's what we need. We had examples of competing electric companies in major California cities where you had 2, maybe 3 sets of poles on opposite sides of the street and people picking off customers on the opposite sides of the street and wires just everywhere. And so this franchising system cleaned up the industries. If you look at the literature and the legislative debate at the time that the CPUC was established, very prominent was this concept of calamitous or ruinous competition. And we were designed to kill competition in the interest of getting cheap capital, because lenders were pretty sure they were going to get repaid, and then building the infrastructure quickly, a lot of money up front for this very, very, very large, expensive infrastructure. So in many respects, it's been pretty successful. The challenge, of course, is that we're now in an era where there are a lot of new technologies that actually can replace some of those centralized functions. And you've seen it in the telecom industry where people basically don't need the same kind of services from a dominant utility. There's actually competition between different providers. So what the hell do we do, given our design, when you start to see competition coming forward? How do we actually operate as a regulator, and how do we ensure that the infrastructure is still there, that it's operated safely, that it's operated at a reasonable cost when you start to see these competitive tools coming into the marketplace? And there are a few things that we've done. Since 1996, we have not allowed the utilities to own new generating facilities. We did go a little further around 2000, 2001 and try to actually allow retail competition for customers using the last piece of true natural monopoly infrastructure, which is the wires. Didn't work very well. There are still scars all over the state of California about that. But we do see competition. We're also able to condition the utilities' procurement in ways that have been very helpful. So as we were starting to focus on grinding carbon out of the electric industry, we started to order them to procure from a narrow range of what we call renewable technologies. In California, that does not include hydro, as it does in most other states and countries, simply because we were trying to force investment in specific technologies: wind, solar, to some extent geothermal, biomass. And so then you have to then look at our renewable portfolio standard, the requirement that utilities provide 33% of their electricity from this narrow range of technologies. Not so much simply as an effort to clean up our electric system, but as an industrial policy. designed to force investment and bring to market scale technologies that weren't really present in California. It's been very successful. Between 2009 and the end of 2012, we issued permits, issued permits and built the interconnection infrastructure for 150 large renewable energy projects over 100 megawatts. And so that actually in turn created jobs. It's built a cadre of developers. We did that through a competitive bake-off between those companies who were seeking to get contracts with the utilities. And then we reviewed the contracts to make sure that they hit the general price range, given the fact that you need to meet certain kinds of electrical needs. So to some extent, we've learned how to deal with innovation in a very clumsy second step way. But as a result of the success of this renewable portfolio standard, which brought the solar PV industry to scale very quickly, we're actually starting to see even more innovation and a new kind of phenomenon. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the convergences. But as people actually are able to buy their own solar photovoltaics, and they aren't so dependent on central station power, that's changing the dynamic. All of a sudden, there's stress on all of the central purchasing facilities. The utilities help to fund it simply because they actually buy the excess electricity from these rooftop arrays, but it's really about customers and individual consumers now starting to get engaged in making decisions. We don't have retail functions at the CPUC. We deal with fairly centralized infrastructure. So this challenge of dealing with innovation and competitive processes even becomes greater. So I'll just point to even a couple of other confounding challenges that we're starting to see in terms of convergence. Currently, only 20% of the carbon that's released into the environment in the state of California comes from the electric utilities. We've actually been very successful. 30% comes from the use of natural gas in buildings, largely for heating, cooking, and cooling. We don't have an RPS for gas. As a matter of fact, nobody talks about it. Everybody talks about the electric system. Everybody wants to spend ratepayer dollars to perfect the electric system. We haven't moved on to gas. If you want to fix Aliso Canyon, then you need to make everybody in the LA basin get rid of their gas water heaters, their gas stoves, and start to move to electric stoves that are actually, and water heaters or solar water heaters that will displace the use of gas. If you look at Aliso Canyon, 60% of the winter use goes to heating people's homes and cooking their food. You can grind everything you can out of the electric industry, but that's not going to solve that. The other 40% chunk of our carbon loading actually comes from transportation. If we want to meet our 2030 and 2050 goals, electric fuels have to begin to displace the gas and the petroleum industry in daily life in California. That's a big transition, and you can't get there simply through the RPS. The RPS is a way to clean up the electric grid, but it ultimately can't help to address our larger goals. The other thing that I see, the convergence that I think is a challenge for everybody to think about, is that wooden poles are actually becoming the most intelligent and most dynamic part of our electric system. They carry more data and more intelligence than any other part of our infrastructure. They carry fiber for cable, they carry plain old telephone system, they carry Vios and VoIP, and now they're starting to carry the latest in wireless broadband, as well as electricity. They are a conveyance that every other industry is using. As a result of this, the utilities who've built a lot of backhaul for their smart meters are starting to think about getting into telecommunications in an unregulated space. Thank you, Reed.
Somebody gave you an old bio, and I apologize, but with so many colleagues and friends in the room from the company formerly known as Google X, where I am a strategist or space cowboy, if you're inside the building, where we do tools and technologies for the innovations I'm going to talk about, and Emerson Collective, my proud home, where I'm managing partner. I want to make that clear because although I will stay the proud founder of Manifest Energy, it is subsumed into those new brands, and in those places, we not only develop the tools and technologies to try to bend the curve on these particular problems, but we do it through the lens of how to have tools and technologies employed in the service of humanity rather than the other way around. And I think that that's sort of fundamental to the exercise of what are you regulating or organizing a rule set to do. What is the outcome you seek? And we've just heard two of the great pros and great leaders talk about how things are and how things should be. Great presentation. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about why they should be the way that Reed characterized it and when. And the why is actually pretty easy when you think of it, notwithstanding the current political environment of rapacious real estate developers who've become neo-fascist candidates, taking on guys with socialist principles from 2 centuries ago. There is a useful way to find who we are as a people and determine that free enterprise is what actually got us here, and therefore arguing against competition at this stage is like some sort of committee at AAA arguing about how to modify a triptych in the age of GPS, right? I mean, this is a question of policy and regulatory obsolescence that innovation is inevitably bringing into focus, right? So unlike so much of the great work that Reed has done and has cited in the induction of new innovation from the demonopolization in telecom markets, this is a case where innovation is percolating up, much of it around this great university and around this valley, in ways that are challenging all the assumptions of the regulators, forcing them to question themselves what they do and whether they're organized appropriately and have the tools appropriately to deal with the retail end of things. We just heard that that's a big sort of stretch. Some of you were at the Tesla factory yesterday with Tony Fidel and I talking about bottom-up revolution, and I cited the case of a very red state, and I will tell you, a red state Republican veteran like my 86-year-old dad, who will get out of the lazy boy and tune down the Fox News to show you on his iPhone that he is paying nothing for the solar city energy being generated on his roof with the next to nothing R65 insulation and the complete LED lighting across his home that he all got at Home Depot, right? With nobody passing him a brochure or making him the green guy or anything else. So there is some utility in Texas that's having to wonder why the suburbs are losing 30% of their sales from previously reliable customers at some point. And the regulators in Texas are not going to be necessarily as progressive as those in California, and they are facing this dilemma here and now, and they don't have any choice. So there's a competition already occurring in the amount of tools diffusing at a rate that is forcing this question. And now the question is, can regulators get into a position where they can turn on the headlights and if you want, the bright beams to see as far as they can with as much peripheral vision as possible to catch up on the need to induce the change, or at least get into some sort of iterative balance with the rate of technological development. And in fact, what's happening now is that they are regulating mostly, in select cases, in the rearview mirror based on tools that they have and what they know in an ecosystem in a dance with an increasingly obsolete counterparty, which is the utilities themselves that are equally lost at the boardroom level. Because for them, their customer is not my dad with the iPhone monitoring the solar city and the LED lights. For them, the customer is the regulatory commission. And so they're talking to themselves in this small echo chamber and sort of missing largely any definitive understanding that would help them understand everything that's happening around them. And in business, if we're talking about business boards, Intel, AMAT, we call this the Kodak moment, right? Not the Kodak moment that if you're in my demographic, you would line up at the edge of the Disneyland castle and go, Kodak moment, here's the picture. No, it's not that Kodak moment. It's the Kodak moment where the board understood that they had the intellectual property that they had devised for digital, and holding onto the intellectual property that was inventing the future, that very great Eastman Kodak company that was the global leader in the chemicals industry decided we will fatally go over the cliff. We will hang on to 35 millimeter canisters for as much cash flow as we can, for as long as we can, until somebody else licenses technology and slays us. And we won't know it until we're actually over the cliff, right? And so we're drifting this way, but nobody wants to believe it, just like nobody on the board of Eastman Kodak wanted to believe it, right? But we're drifting this way because there will be more Nest thermostats, and if they're not by Nest, they'll be by Honeywell, where there will be more solar cities. These are all inevitability and trends. So when we talk about the when and the why, I don't think we have to think about if. We need to only think about what is the logical timetable. And I like to call this a TBD, but not in the normal sense of to be determined. I like to call it TBD, like in the imperative sense, like transition by design. We will either get to the future intentionally in a way that we design the rule sets to optimize for societal outcomes on a time frame that is consequential to the outcomes we seek, or we will get there reactively, drifting by default with massive dislocations, and we will have case studies in arrears about why our regulatory and policymakers failed us because they could not understand everything that was actually happening in competitive markets around them, even as they tried to suppress them. Right? So what Reed has put out in front of us is a roadmap, a potential roadmap. There's some of it I would embrace, there's some of it I would argue with, but a roadmap nonetheless. And I think he's basically saying, it would be useful for government to restore itself in that role for those things that government must do, because only government can do and is indispensable to doing. Right? That's not an overreaching Bernie land of how do I take over everything and make the post office eclipse FedEx or whatever he's thinking, right? And that's not how do I be kind to my buddies and let a few big companies succeed in Donald land and push out the ladies with the eminent domain, whatever is going on there, right? I mean, so it is that zone in the middle of enabling a competitive landscape of people to perform for societal good. And we know how markets perform, but we've got to make markets perform in predictable, elongated ways. Reed and I were just joking before we came up here about collaborating on what I used to call the Clean Energy Bank of the United States, and he called championed the Green Bank, and we said, that handoff, those discussions might have been the last bipartisan acts, in Washington, right? That's all moved to California now. And I think we're approaching the 10-year anniversary of the last comprehensive, durable, bipartisan energy legislation we had, omnibus energy legislation. And you can see ACEEE just recently issued a report on that with the $2 trillion saved for consumers, 17 gigatons or whatever greenhouse gases. We predicted 10 when we reduced. I mean, an enormous success. Crossing 2 administrations and probably into the future. But it's got to be updated, and updated with recurring frequency and iterations to match what is happening technologically sort of in the environment around us. And so we are overdue for that update. And so any new administration would be ill-informed to say, I think I'll just ride on what happened in 2007 before shale and on the first year that iPhones were in the marketplace. I think we'll just ride that into the future. The future will happen anyway. It will percolate up. Companies will make money, but the dislocations will occur, and that I call a major micro problem. We spent a lot of time on the macro problem of climate change, and now we know that there's a big global frame, unfortunately, without measurement, reporting, verification, and the other sort of tools we need to bring the global frame into order. But there's a global frame that says we have certain goals by certain dates of certain things we need to do. So we've got the macro problem on the climate side that forces an imperative and a timetable that says, well, even if I'm just in charge of California or Texas or DC buildings or vehicles or telecom, I actually have to think bigger. I have to think about larger jurisdictions like everything at once and how to collaborate, right? So that's a whole new world. I also worry a lot about what we alluded to and Reed was very explicit about. And I worry particularly a lot about it in my role at Emerson, which is the dislocations being occurred and the injustices that occur as the inevitable evolution of the social compact begins to create a schism between have and have-nots. Okay, and here I'm not talking, again, please don't confuse me as a person when I talk about justice in these things, who says, well, if we could just rob Peter to pay Paul, centralize everything and redistribute, that we'd be, I lived fighting the Cold War, and socialism to me is like as absurd of a conversation you could possibly have. But that's not to say you can't make things equitable and just if you are regulating correctly and the government is exercising its appropriate authorities. So at a time when we're having more panels go into Atherton than East Palo Alto, and we're parking more Teslas next to Range Rovers, while 18 different people try to get into an 18-year-old truck to get to their jobs, we've got to pay some very close attention to what the real numbers are in the bell curve, and I think you cited some of them in society. And what does that mean? That means forefront, our regulators need to be saying not just, well, how do we save the utilities? Because they sure suck at this. I mean, that's the conversation we generally have. There was a great reason for them, and there was. Historically, in every way, there was a great reason for the original social compact, which was ubiquity, uniformity, and reliable access to energy to every person who could get it, to electricity rather, right? That was good. It was a just check, achieved, done. A bit like the postman, going through rain and snow and sleet and everything else, and then FedEx coming and saying, I can do it before 10 a.m., right? Done. That's okay. We can evolve, right? So we have done that. Now we're actually saying, but we need that ubiquity and uniformity and reliability and affordability, which is the mandate, to include the attributes of other things we need, like air we can breathe, like an ecosystem that is stable and reliable and has some predictability so that we can evolve inside of it, so that our kids can inherit it. We need these sort of attributes. And beyond that now, even if you didn't care about that stuff, we need the Tony Fidels and the Googles of the world actually saying we need to offer the optionality of comfort and convenience and choice for people who now want to employ devices on their own and be a part of this system and not impede their access to the market in an otherwise competitive world. So what I would say is the new social compact has to be the frame through which we look at things. How do we go beyond this in a place where people care about the attributes that we seek without having this occur on the back of those who are renters or dislocated or uninformed, with less access to education, with less access to capital? That's not a little bit of our society. That is a very large piece of it. And if you don't incorporate that in the new regulatory rule set, we will have failed. Macro problem, micro problem, moral imperative, sense of urgency, inevitability, transition by design. These are the things that have to happen, and we can only achieve that when markets are sufficiently competitive to let it occur.
Do you mind if I ask where you get your coffee?
Huh? I was just out in the lobby. I took decaf. So,
I want to say that I've never spoken to such a well-informed and smart and influential audience, except for the time that I had coffee one-on-one with John Podesta. Is John in the house? Not yet. Well, we can look forward to that. I'm a lawyer. That's something you have to admit with a certain amount of sheepishness here in the epicenter of innovation. And worse than that, I'm a son of a lawyer. And I have sued a lot of people, and I've been sued a lot, and I've regulated, and I've deregulated, and I've worked on legislation, and I've tried to get rid of legislation. And what have I concluded? There are three dimensions of the rule of law. They are legislation and regulation and litigation. They are very closely intertwined, In our system, every piece of legislation leads to regulation, and then it leads to litigation about that regulation. You can't look at these as separate cabins. They are utterly and totally a seamless and protracted story of trying to use the rule of law to create a just, fair, and decent society that enjoys a high and rising standard of living for all. For all the reasons stated earlier today, we know that that kind of society cannot continue to exist unless the next president presides over a very, very rapid transition from an economy and a society based on a carbon platform to an economy and a society based on a clean energy platform. And I know that can be done. This device that I dropped, I'd like you to just remember where you left yours, turn it off, and just think for a second that you are going in a time machine and you're going back to when I was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission in the years 1993 to 1997, and I got news for you, it doesn't work when you get out of that time machine. In fact, there's not one single device in use for communications today, from the TV to the dish to the phone, that would work if you took it back to that time period. It wouldn't work because between that date and actually the early 2000s, actually between 1995 and 2003, in 8 years is a two-term presidency, so I'm giving the 8-year agenda for the next president in energy by way of analogy. In the time period from 1995 to 2003, $1 trillion was invested in the United States to go from a communications platform that was analog to digital, from circuit to packet, from fixed to mobile, and many other transitions along the way of a technological nature. And it was incredibly disruptive of every business activity, not just in that sector, but every business activity in the country. And as Arun said earlier, the United States had the special privilege of leading the world in this profound change. By the year 2020, 80% of the adults in the world will have one of these. 80% of the adults in the world will have one of these. And so if the United States leads between 2017 and 2025, in that 8 years, to put approximately the same amount of money, maybe a little closer to 2, because we have to adjust for inflation, between $1 and $2 trillion into building a clean energy platform, we will find that the United States and everybody who is involved in this transformation will have the special privilege and the ticket to heaven, because we will have shown the entire world how to make this transition. Now, there are certain outcomes as we think about using the rule of law for this transition that I think we should agree on, but you might not agree. I've never invented everything, but I just invent arguments, so you can take it for what it is. First, this transition should cause the GDP to go up and not down. Second, it should make consumers better off, not worse off. 3, the costs of this transition should be allocated fairly, meaning they should be allocated according to a progressive system. It should not be what we actually do today in very large part. We subsidize the move to clean energy for the rich, and we do it on the backs of the poor. That is something that needs to change. We talk about job creation in the United States. We have unemployment at 5%. We need to talk about the improvement in the standard of living. The second and third quintiles in the United States have not seen any noticeable growth in income since 1979. The top 1% in income in the United States have seen, in real constant dollar terms, their annual income triple from $300,000 to $1 million a year in that time period. So when we talk about seeking outcomes through changing the rule of law, we need to start talking about progressive allocation of costs, a la the income tax, which is why we need to talk about the funding being on the backs of the federal government, not on the state government, because it is the federal government where we have a progressive income tax system. And we also need to think very seriously about the following, and I'd like the next president to state these things. We need to talk about this transition without victims. We need to talk about not blaming people because they used to dig up coal for a living or they built businesses that burned coal. We need to talk about how they can be de-victimized, How much money would it take? These are ballpark numbers. About $50 billion would buy a lifetime pension for every single person working in the coal industry today. That's a lump sum number for all of those people. If they're going to be forced by regulation and litigation out of that work, why do we have to have them bear all of the personal cost for that change? About $20 billion would buy all the stock in all the publicly traded coal companies in the United States. And if we added 10% as a surcharge to all electricity bills to create a universal service fund to subsidize the cost of electricity to low-income people, we would only be doing exactly what already exists in the communication space. The next time you look at your telephone bill, you'll see a line item on it that is a charge that was imposed by me and my successors at the FCC to create a universal service fund. And electricity is the only utility in the United States that does not have a national universal service fund to guarantee that everyone can afford to buy the product. These are the outcomes that I think we want to seek. Now, with respect to litigation itself, well, we need to talk, when you think about litigation, about the specific goals. I think the specific goal in litigation needs to be that approximately 1/3 of the electricity that comes from burning coal, it can't come from burning coal anymore. And the second goal is that that gap cannot be substituted with natural gas. It has to be substituted with something else. So this is a big change. And folks, this is a smaller change than the move of the old wireline telephone companies from being fixed-line companies to mobile companies. It is a smaller change than that. These companies that you know today, AT&T and Verizon, these are companies that were fixed-line telephone companies in the early 1990s, and every one of them went through the biggest business transformation in the history of business change, and we can see lesser changes accomplish all the goals we want in clean energy. Second goal. The second goal needs to be that we have an approach to competition, and I'm making my suggestion there. On the left-hand side, we ought to have competition in generation. We ought to agree that that is exactly what we want. We do not want vertical integration backwards into that space, and we want that competition to be competition among the renewables that will compete to substitute for the coal. Like I said, I've never invented anything, but I'm inventing arguments, and you can disagree or you can agree, but the next president has to make her mind up on this topic. I went to law school with the Clintons. You have to, I have to have a bias on it. She didn't go out with me, and if she had, I'd be president. But anyhow, in the middle, the transmission and the distribution network, these are shared monopolies. These are not going to be overbuilt infrastructures. And because they're shared monopolies, they need to have open access on this side, and they need to stop the definition of their markets on the right-hand side. And if you've read, or if you've ever seen John Oliver talk about the FCC chairman, or you've read about net neutrality, that concept that there is when there's a monopoly distribution network, as in the case of broadband, it ought to be open and neutral. That's the same concept we're talking about here. And then on the far right-hand side, behind the meter, we need robust competition. So what are the 3 lawsuits that the next president is going to have to sit down with the staff and talk about right away, or even now before the election would be nice? Maybe don't talk about all these different techniques then, there's bigger fish to fry. But what are the 3 lawsuits where it's going to be necessary to have yes or no answers? This is my conclusion. Thank you, panelists. First, yes or no, is the Department of Justice going to sue ExxonMobil for willful concealment of the fact of global warming? Already state attorney generals are doing it. You can't say that the issue is disappearing. You have to say yes or no. You can offer a settlement. You could offer a settlement where the company contributed a certain amount of money that, what do you know, it could capitalize all those other needs that I mentioned. Has this ever been done to any industry? Tobacco. There are plenty of examples. Number 2, it is going to be necessary to decide yes or no, are the utilities that occupy that monopoly position there in the middle, are the utilities that are using that monopoly position to gain market advantage on the right-hand side or on the left-hand side. Market advantage on the distribution side, over on the distribution side, past the meter, for example, to seek from regulators rules that favor the utility and disfavor a distributed generation company. Are there utilities that are doing that? Are there utilities that are vertically integrating back the other way and using the guaranteed access to their network to gain competitive advantage in the generation competition market? Because the answer is there are such utilities, and they are in many, many different states. They're not in all states, but they're in many, many different states. And yes or no, the Department of Justice is going to have to decide whether to bring that lawsuit or not. Has that ever been done before? One of the greatest members of the Stanford faculty ever was Bill Baxter, fantastic economist. In 1981, George Schultz will remember this, in 1981, he was named the head of the antitrust division. He inherited a lawsuit that had been filed in the Carter administration called United States versus AT&T. AT&T in that time period was the entirety of the telephone network. It wasn't some of the telephone network. It was a monopoly that had been granted in 1913, and it was the single largest market cap country in the United States, and more people held AT&T stock than held the stock of any other company in the United States. And the Carter administration had the audacity to sue, to break them up, to confine that company to the middle, to being just the distribution monopoly, and not to be able to compete in the other related markets like the telephone business that connects to the wire. So in comes Ronald Reagan, and he doesn't like regulation, and everybody says this lawsuit's going to be dropped, and the great Bill Baxter sits down and says, well, who's making the decisions here? I'm the head of the antitrust division. I'm making the decisions here. And he continues the lawsuit, and he wins the lawsuit, and he breaks up AT&T. And it is because of that, it's too long a story, because of that, over the course of time, the rest that happened in telecom leading all the way up to the 96 Telecom Act was enabled because of that decision by Bill Baxter. And it's the exact same decision that needs to be made by the next president with respect to the shape of these markets. So, there's one last thing, mergers. So the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission, doesn't really matter which, could make its mind up with respect to mergers, and there's a wave of mergers going on right now in the utility industry, and it could take the following view. We will not approve any merger unless the companies agree to adopt all the principles of competition on this slide, in perpetuity. And unless they agree to contribute to that universal service fund that I earlier mentioned to you, and anything else you want to add. And now you may say, that's just outrageous. That's never done except for that AT&T, except for the Charter, the cable company, just stipulated to the exact same terms to get its approval from the FCC for its merger with Time Warner yesterday. There are analogies and precedents for every single thing I've talked about. The next president just has to look them up and decide. Thank you very much.
One of the key issues confronting the United States right now is whether, how, and how much to allow for competition in the energy space, especially in the parts of the energy industry that have historically been heavily regulated, especially by public utility commissions. The panel now is composed of a really amazing group of people that are going to share their perspectives on the role of competition in advancing the clean energy economy. Well, three very interesting perspectives, obviously coming from very different places. I'm curious how all of you think about, one issue that perhaps is particularly salient in California, certainly for folks that work in California government, is keeping the lights on. And in contrast to cellular telephony and cellular communications where, calls get dropped. It happens on Sand Hill Road all the time. Electricity is not a space where we have tolerated, historically, problems with reliability. And that's a big part of the reason for the heavy investment in the kind of centralized infrastructure that we have now. How do you think about incorporating the changing value of reliability and balancing that against the need to innovate and the need to create greater customer choice in the new energy future. How should the president think about that?
I don't know that those are opposing objectives. I think that they require a much different mindset. And so we're quickly reaching the point where people are going to have a community solar array in one circuit. They're going to have electric vehicle chargers or electric bus rapid transit on another circuit. And you need to get the power up the grid and over to the other side. And so part of what we need then is a much more nimble grid. That's infrastructure. I hate to say it, we're going to have to replace a lot of old wooden poles that carry that. We actually need to have smart transformers that can tell you when something's happening at the end of a thin feeder circuit and communicate to another thin feeder circuit on the other side to say, I have excess electricity, I need some excess electricity, and then maybe report it up the line to some central store that's the backup, the central bank for electricity. That's essentially what the ISOs do, the independent systems operators, the balancing authorities. The pieces are there, we just have to make it more nimble. What I see as the big obstacle, because I'm talking to New York State about this all the time, is that someplace in there we need that router that actually can read all those things and operate it. What is the system architecture that this system has? Once we figure that out, not only will these issues be resolved for a while, but we will actually be able to make the whole system more plug and play and more amenable to more customer choice. It'll bring down the cost of using these technologies. It'll do everything that the same kind of systems have for the internet and for telephony. But we have to really apply ourselves to that and make those right investments. My problem as a regulator is that we don't understand that well enough to really make a wholesale investment here in California. So we've sort of been playing it, let's walk, let's jog, let's run. Let's try to keep up or ahead of technology without getting in the way.
Well, so I work on moonshots. That's, and sometimes you hit and sometimes you don't, but those are long-range, big breakthrough technical problems and challenges to big intractable things. So a moonshot is not even, some people could argue, SpaceX landing a rocket yesterday. That's not a moonshot. That was a technical problem solved within the physical. That's great. None of what you're asking about is even remotely in the zip code of moonshot or SpaceX, right? I mean, this is technically viable. We have the tools, the technology, the know-how, and everything. Do we have them in the right place? Do all the right people understand them to organize rule sets around them? No. Are we investing huge amounts of money in government relations, advocacy, and lobbying to peddle fear on this question? Yes. This is the Joe the Camel argument, to go to your to your thing, that we can't get there with this much disaggregation and distribution because sooner or later the lights will go off for all of us. And maybe we'll have a few dislocations where people will say, those are proof points. They went off, and the clock can be right twice a day. I know Arun's work at Google and here at Stanford, seeks to optimize this. There's too many people working on this, the technology and engineering and technical problem solving around this. So I don't want to say it's a red herring in the sense that it is a very real problem to manage, solve, and implement, but you inevitably are forced to. It's not like we're going to have a choice. We're not going to get there first on storage and then go, but let's wait to figure out how to integrate the storage. It's not like we're going to, proliferate more on control in the digital home and say, let's really wait until a utility can guarantee it. I can remember when I lived in Hong Kong in the 90s, and Hong Kong is free market, things come in from everywhere, and there was actually a video fax machine with that it was slow, but bits and bytes of video, and I thought, this is so cool. I'm going to take one of these fax machines home with me to the U.S. And you remember there's the sticker on the bottom by the FCC going, if you plug this into any RJ11 jack, it will be Armageddon. The world will blow up if something that we have not approved creates non-reliability through your RJ11 jack in your home. So you want innovation, not go to the website, read our brochure and buy a Princess phone, but don't even remotely think about an RJ11 jack plug-in on your own, right? And that's where the utilities are with some of this now. You know, we have the tools, the techniques, the science, the engineering, and everything else to problem solve. We're not sufficiently organized or informed with the integrity necessary to create the rule sets to maximize that technical engineering and integrate it into our systems at a rate that the devices are coming online.
I'll just, it was earlier mentioned that about 25% of the people on the planet do not have electricity. It is inconceivable that the way that they will get affordable electricity is by rebuilding the electricity distribution architecture of France or Pennsylvania. That's not going to happen. They are going to have a distributed architecture, and it can be and will be designed appropriately, and it does need money, and they do need to stop burning carbon products and move directly to this new architecture.
So, Reed pointed strongly, I think, to the idea that there needs to be an enhanced role for the federal government, for the president, in looking at antitrust questions, right? Questions around competition and fair competition on the customer side of the energy picture, perhaps also on the wholesale side. The question I would have is, you know, what is the right, traditionally the customer side of electricity has been a preserve of state authority. The Federal Power Act says that the federal government has jurisdiction over wholesale interstate energy and not retail. So what is the appropriate role for the new president in changing that relationship, trying to create a national market for some of the technologies that Andy would like to see brought to market? What is the appropriate role, what is the appropriate continuing role for the state public utility commissions, which have traditionally managed that retail relationship?
I don't have a good answer to that just yet. It's why I talk a lot to my colleagues in the state of New York, because we think that if you want these technologies to reach scale quickly and for the price to drop and for people to invest not only in the technology themselves, but in increasing manufacturing of rooftop solar, of residential battery storage, of smart inverters that can deal with a lot of other issues that come up in the electric grid, smart meters, aggregate demand response products out of hundreds of individual consumers that can then bid into markets and actually compete with central station generation. We have to have some consistency. And we're not getting a lot of leadership from FERC. I think what we're getting is appropriate right now. They're letting us be the laboratories, and they're stepping back sometimes. Periodically, they get in the way. But that's our challenge as well, is that as these new technologies come into the marketplace, how do we enable them and not stifle them, but keep the system operating and fair?
Well, you know, FERC's had its fingers burned. You know, they've taken a run at this, you know, in the 90s, and had to withdraw from that, from some of the perverse and adverse effects that came from the push towards a national competitive market in electricity, right? I mean, this is in Wonkyville, but there's a lot of wonks in the room. So you know, if we're taking it into a simple form, you know, we'd have to sort of just step back as a people for a moment and say, how can it be? How can it be that we have fungibility and liquidity for BTUs of liquid energy across the nation, but we have a completely different rule set that is balkanized, that is illiquid for electrons across the nation? How could we have two separate sets for the manifestation of the same thing, the delivery of energy to our people in an optimized form with the greatest efficiencies and a free enterprise economy? I mean, that's just dumb. It's like, choose one or the other. Are we, you know, this is Britain. Are we driving on the left side of the road, but only with the buses, you know, and the motorcycles come next week? I mean, it's just dumb, right? So we have to address the question with some seriousness. And if we've been burnt before in the 90s because it wasn't right, or my friend Pat Wood and sought to do this in more regionalized basis with the RTOs, et cetera, well, then let's take another look at it and say, how do we take it from laboratories, but actually say, well, let's just fortify and crown the PUCs and say we understand why these are all the domain and jurisdiction of the states. But we need to update and modernize it commensurate with the attributes and outcomes and goals of the more logical national policy in a globally connected and not dislocated market that we live in. If we live in a connected world, we certainly live in a connected country now, that means the 100-year-old model of state by state by state needs to be rethought through. And that may happen on the back of a lawsuit. I don't think it'll be against ExxonMobil. I think it may be challenging the Interstate Commerce Clause and the idea that I can't send electrons from Nevada into California based on a solar guy across the border. If my house is 2 houses down at Lake Tahoe, I can't send it across the border because the 2 different states disagree on the fungibility of that clean, cost-effective electron. And it should be a huge differentiation in price because the Nevada utility needs to protect itself and has more friendly regulators about how to calcify its monopolistic powers. That whole model has to come down, right? And so it will be changed. And if it's not changed by legislation or regulation, Reed's right. It'll happen with litigation. But I think there is some inevitability that we will get to greater fungibility, efficiency, and liquidity of electrons that match what we've been doing with BTUs for years.
So 3 things. First of all, everyone here should read Michael's article when it comes out in the NYU Law Review, because he knows more about the answer to this question, as you will see when you see that article, certainly than I do. The second thing I'd like to say is there are a number of states already in the United States that are more zealously pro-competition along the lines that I described on that chart than the federal government has ever been. And it is the same with respect to every sectoral reform that you see in the United States. So the telecom reforms were actually led by the state of New York and the state of Illinois. So that's why the laboratories of democracy actually work pretty well. And then lastly, you're asking a question about our federalism. It was the exact same question presented in the telecom era. The same regulatory commissions do the electricity and do telecom, and the telecom-y side of them were very, very anxious about the intrusion of the federal government in the 1990s along the lines of the story that I just mentioned. And they sued me in a lawsuit that I used to call States versus Reed. But its official name was AT&T versus Iowa Utilities Board, and it went to the Supreme Court in 1990, and Justice Scalia wrote the majority opinion vindicating the idea that the federal government could establish a national methodology for the sector. It couldn't set the exact price state by state, but it could establish a national methodology, which is exactly what you're talking about. And that's exactly what we now know from that Supreme Court case is, in fact, permissible.
This is not going to be an even transition. We're in the midst of things that are bubbling up from below and destabilizing fairly old structures. And I don't think that anybody has a perfect vision on how you make it national. And so I'll just point to the fact that one of the things that we wrestled with as we got large amounts of variable renewable energy, the wind blows at different times of the day than when people are using electricity. Solar tends to drop off as the sun gets closer to the horizon. So we have a variable electric system now. What we started to do is look in California, what can we do with other states? How do we begin to do that? And we set up what's sort of a meetup for electrons. We called it the energy imbalance market for some arcane reason. That's what everybody wanted it to be. I think it was an economist and a lawyer who got together and picked the name. But what essentially we're doing is we're buying excess renewables for other states across the West, because their wind blows at a different time of the day. And there's a 2-hour difference between when the sun comes up in New Mexico and when it comes up here, and vice versa. And so we start to do these trades. And it's been fairly informal. The FERC agreed to look the other way and let us do this. Very comforting to know that they were paying attention, but not deciding that they had to act on it. And it's been fairly successful. What we're starting to see now is the utilities who have participated in this very, very limited market are starting to say, well, what else could we do if we actually had west-wide markets and we're trading? Now the challenge is the utility regulators kind of say, you know, that energy imbalance market thing, it worked. It wasn't really an oddball court, and we just had to look the other way when it happened. And now here's this other opportunity to do a larger kind of a market in the West. How do we actually allow that, protect people against market abuses, make sure that we protect the environmental goals that we have here in California and Washington and Oregon, but at the same time take advantage of this larger potential market? These are big challenges in the West. They've settled them in the East Coast from the top down. Here, given the fact that we all breathe the free and clean air of the West, as opposed to being tied to decadent British imperialism like they are on the East Coast, we're going to have to find this for ourselves. And it's not going to look like the solutions that people have elsewhere in the country, partly because of our energy needs and the way we can generate that without carbon. So I think that there is a need to have national markets, particularly where you're trying to get to scale with new technologies. But at the same time, this is a big country. It's a damn big country.
But notwithstanding, I'm from Texas. I love the pride thing, so I'm all about that. East Coast, West Coast, Texas. But I think that there's some things that cut across all those things, right? I mean, an S thermostat's available everywhere, whether you're a competitive thermostat, whether you're a competitive market, a regulated market, a monopoly, whatever. The devices are available everywhere, and the paradigm of the people that you are regulating to purvey them, interact on them, manage the thing, have the same dilemma everywhere. So even if you have different laboratories and differentiated cultures and different structures and politics and everything yielding all these different solutions, that's not to say we shouldn't be on a learning curve to distill best of as fast as possible, because the curves of the penetration and what's happening as fast as possible. It's not what Andy wants on a technology push basis. It's what society is evolving on a demand pull basis. This is occurring inevitably whether we want it or not, and it is occurring faster than policymakers and regulators have the agility to perform in any useful way for society good on the macro or micro problem. So fora like this are meant to be bringing convergence to that dialogue. And so we need some intelligent core plans distilled from all those sort of regional lessons. And what I would tell you is, first amongst them is we're going to have to move from regulators that are in symbiotic relationships with the legacy purveyors, the utilities, and saying, how do we sort of protect your interest to have the last throes of the 20th century's best social compact? And they're going to have to jump ahead and say, what is the 21st century social compact with the inevitability of these new devices? And right now, they're kind of caught in a schizophrenic conundrum around these things. And you got to get through that conundrum and break through that and decisively say, we're going to live in the future. And when you do, you're going to get to this liquidity, you're going to get to this competition, and you're going to get to the technical change. One more thing. Before I became a regulator trying to promulgate markets and LED lights and everything else, my whole career as an independent power developer was as a result of the regulation of PURPA and the PURPA reforms, right? Public Utility Reform? Regulatory Policy Act? Yeah. And which created the independent power industry, right? So you got in the independent power industry when I did in the mid to late 80s, old guy now. And you would you'd go talk to the utilities who were saying the same thing. Boy, there's a sticker on the bottom of that power plant. You blow up the whole system just by being a privately owned power plant. And say, we can't do this. It'll make us unreliable. It'll make us non-affordable. We need to protect the system. Let's lock down. It's the exact same behaviors. that is innate in any monopoly, protecting its own interest, right? And so once we calmed them down, and then and the court cases were settled, and we agreed to let them all create private sector subsidiaries to join us in joint ventures so they could profit it as we slayed their inefficiencies. You know, once we came to the new paradigm that allowed the independent power industry to emerge, you know, we found out, gosh, the thing that really bothered them most was that their whole life, their whole industry for electricity delivery was all about load forecasting. And load forecasting back then was month ahead. Load forecasting. When is the major maintenance on the coal plant that operates at 61%? Next month. Good, see you at the country club. You know, and that was load forecast. So then these IPPs came on, and there are all these privately owned entities all of a sudden, and this monopolistic behavior, and they're going, we got to do week ahead forecasting? Are you serious? Week ahead? We've got to plan with the things. And now what they're actually having to do is day by day, minute by minute, meteorologically induced forecasting because of cloud cover with the solar, and when does the storage come on to hedge the pricing and everything else. So everybody's got to think. Oh my God, you know, this is like a world away from 25 years ago in the independent power industry with like a month ahead. It's like we got to think, we got to work with Arun and find out how to engineer ourselves so we can incorporate a battery with a solar panel with an S-therm. This is killing us. You know, they're going to kill us, right? Okay, then let them go. Right? Either they're going to become participants in what is inevitable, what society demands, what we must have for grand micro and macro challenges, or they're going to go the way of Eastman Kodak. But having the schizophrenic conundrum to say, can we just do it so it's only day by day or minute by minute? They're going to have to be commensurate with the technology because it's not optional. We're not trying to induce this ramp in the diffusion of innovation. It is occurring anyway.
So let me ask a follow-up question, maybe for Reed and Michael, that relates to what Andy just said. A number of the utilities are interested in participating in this, right? So in California, we have a split. PG&E wants to rate base their electric vehicle charging. Other utilities want to take a different approach. In Georgia, Georgia Power wants to participate, maybe control, the distributed solar market. Other utilities are exploring the idea of having an unregulated subsidiary along the lines of what Andy was saying, participate in this distributed energy revolution. So Reed pointed to the example of the baby bells, the wireline utilities that transformed themselves into the Verizon and AT&T of today. They went through that Kodak moment and saw it as an opportunity and were able to transform themselves. What's the right approach to these, whether they're dinosaurs, whether they are companies that are facing a transformative moment and an opportunity? What's the right approach to facilitating their participation or allowing their participation without creating a situation where they can abuse their monopoly power, their incumbent monopoly power, to forestall competition with the Nest thermostats of the world?
Well, I think we have a very imperfect description of what we want the end state to be. We don't really talk about what we want. We talk about other metrics. How many renewable energy power plants have you got in your system? How much of your electricity comes from renewables? We aren't talking about reducing carbon. What we want from our energy system, whether it's electric or gas for heating, cooking and cooling, or it's for transportation, is greenhouse gas emissions down, reliability up, and cost effectiveness. And cost effectiveness probably means something different in the future because it's going to actually focus somewhat on value. My telephone is much more expensive than my landline was, but it does a lot more things for me. And so I think that we're going to start to find that the energy system can actually supply more of those opportunities for people as well. As I said, we're starting to see a convergence between the electric industry and telecommunications. So I think we have to really describe what we want the end state to be like so people are all shooting at the same thing. We have to have better ways to measure it than just focusing on individual technologies. Then I think we have to really examine what are the barriers to achieving that and smooth them. I'll just say that we can be a regulatory friction. It's pretty clear to me that if it takes us 4 years to actually do a standard for interconnection of distributed energy resource technologies, and now we have to go back and redo portions of it for energy storage as a new kind of distributed energy resource. That's not a very effective way, because in 3 years, that battery storage market has actually begun to mature and accelerate even before we can describe how it's going to fit in the system. So we have to all kind of get some general sense of what we want that end state to be. Second, I think that there is a role for that kind of central financing for infrastructure that the utilities do. Nobody wants to own their own goddamn wooden pole in their backyard. That's not a very competitive marketplace. It's kind of a pain in the ass. You know, people want to put their posters on it. Nobody wants to maintain it. You have squabbles between all the people using that same piece of infrastructure. So there's going to remain that piece of it that probably is a natural monopoly. We need to have better ways to deal with that. And then I think we're going to have to figure out, how do people actually begin to do these? We're about to enter into a big experiment here. We've had 2 in Southern California, Edison's territory. Once, when San Onofre disappeared from the grid, that created a big hole because the system was designed around that. You can't deal with it immediately. You got to do something. One of the things that we said to them is, okay, go fill it. Give us 50% of that from no carbon resources, not just renewable energy, but no carbon resources. So they made the biggest commercial purchase of battery infrastructure in the U.S. Big boost to the battery industry. 200 megawatts scattered at 4 substations, as well as a lot of stuff behind the meter that customers chose and brought forward, and the utility helped to finance. So I think that it's there. I think that we actually need to sometimes get out of the way to allow them to do that, or give them the right kinds of signals. Yes, you will get reimbursed for your cost of purchasing that infrastructure, plus a fair return on your investment dollars, so that your investors are willing to keep loaning you cheap money, so that capital costs don't become a big part of this transition. They're also going to bring forward about $500 million of improvements to the distribution system that's going to support all these distributed energy resources that will allow more customer choice and customer value. And we're probably going to make them start to compete against some private providers of some of those tools. Do we need to upgrade a substation, or can it be met by 5,000 rooftop solar arrays with smart inverters, actually creating some of the ancillary services that you'd otherwise meet with expanded a substation, and bidding that into a market? So we're about to start to investigate these things. Nobody has a clear idea how it's going to work, but we'll walk, jog, run.
So monopoly is not an evil word. You can earn a monopoly. That's called winning in competition. Businesses that earn monopolies in competition will find that sooner or later someone will bypass them and they will find that it's eroded. Or you can have, as is the case here, a natural monopoly, meaning it's not possible to imagine economically that someone else would put up all those poles and attach those same lines to all of those houses to have universal service. So that is a monopoly that is there to stay. But the policy decision is, what are the limits that law is going to define around the extent of that monopoly? So you would ask the question this way: why would we ever want the distribution utility to be in the business of installing energy efficiency or distributed solar behind the meter? What would be the positive reason for that? I'll make the case in a nutshell. They're really big, and they'll do whatever they're told by the regulators, and this is really important, so we have to hurry.
They have cheap capital, and they get to scale quick.
And the reason they have cheap capital is because they don't have any risks, because they
protected.
don't have any competition in the natural monopoly.
Bingo.
And the regulator guarantees a return. That's the strongest possible argument. I personally think it's a losing argument. I think that way you never find out what innovation really can get for you,
Yep.
and you never find out what competition is about to invent, and you foreclose the risk of the future turning out to produce rewards that are unimaginable.
I'll just counterpose the success of the renewable portfolio standards across the country against that.
I don't understand that.
Okay, renewable portfolio standards require the incumbent electric utilities, most of whom are monopolies, some of them are public utilities, to meet customer need through this range of technologies we deem to be renewable. You have
That's
to,
okay.
and so they did that. They did that really well. They brought down the price. They created.
But that, you're just telling them to buy in a competitive market different sources. That's fine.
Oh, okay, but all I'm saying is that it was that use of their cheap capital and their ability to get to scale quickly that actually made this happen.
But cheap capital's not scarce. I mean, it's not scarce. You know, if I look around in the world of industry and balance sheets and availability and cost of capital, I would actually consider most of the purveyors in the utility industry, who I know are the ones that, you have to deal with, but they are the weak zebras, okay? They are the easiest ones to pick off and say, let's gobble them up in a massive consolidation if they don't have too many liabilities. So yes, they have cheap capital because they're monopolistically protected jurisdictions that are functionally outsourced taxation authorities regulated by the government. That's who they are. So yes, that'll make you cheap capital, right? But that's not cheaper than Google or Applied Materials or Intel's capital, right? And the new participants are out there. So I'm not worried about.
You guys came in late on Ivanpah. You guys came in late on a variety of other projects. Somebody else had to step up first, and that was the utilities who issued that PPA, got construction underway. So I applaud your entrance into that market, you weren't first.
But
you were a follower. You were a follower.
And not only that, a follower into distributing electricity at all, right? And by the way, there will be other followers in numerous form coming in new ways. That's right. I salute the utility industry as much as I salute Alexander Graham Bell and Edison, right? There is a role for these first actors to enable these earlier forms of the social compact. What we're talking about now is evolving the social compact, which is not a choice. We are splitting this country now amongst those that are educated and affluent and can put a solar rooftop, and avoid being part of the commons, which was part of the old social compact, leaving the heaviest cost and the dirtiest energy and everything to everybody else.
Yeah, but I live in the Central Valley. That's the place that didn't get electricity first.
And I'm not questioning you on this.
It was San Francisco and LA that got it because those were fat markets.
So I'm not questioning you on this. But wait a second. I mean, what you have said, I totally agree with. Your previous statement, within your role, and I know you are heroic, and California is a leader in these things. Don't mistake what I'm saying. But what you outlined in your previous comments is we are missing a strategy.
Yes.
That's basically what you said.
Yes.
You basically said the succession of steps to the outcome we need and the cadence and time frame to get there isn't there. And you're having to react with the tool set you've got, with the partners you're dancing with. Right? And so this is the core takeaway that this panel needs. And Reed put up an example of what it should be or can be in a roadmap. What's the strategy? Right. Your question then was, what do you do with the legacy players? And this idea of bifurcating along the lines that you said, or maybe trifurcating, who generates, who transmits, and who ultimately delivers is something that requires focus, because that last mile of the commons has to be taken care of. And that is the likely, probable role of the privileged actors whose balance sheets we have embellished to arrive at this point. And we need a strategy to focus them there so that we can onboard the generation and efficiency devices and the other things in a more competitive way.
Well, let me just put it in a nutshell for us, what we see happening here in California. If, in fact, decarbonizing transportation is important, then do we allow the electric industry to actually lease you an electric vehicle along with your interconnection and with the fuel? Does that bring the cost of mass transit down? Do we actually extend that to actually fueling bulk transit, bus rapid transit, or munis like downtown San Francisco or light rail in LA, where part of your fare actually becomes part of that?
I'd say as long as you don't exclude others to compete with it, kind of why not?
Okay,
You know?
so how many people do you allow have tracks down the middle of the street in San Francisco? They had that problem. They forced a monopoly.
It's a famous Supreme Court case, actually,
Yeah.
that goes to all the issues we're discussing today. When
Yeah.
do you let a utility go bankrupt?
Yeah.
I'd just like to close with one final question. I think you've all expressed a diversity of views, shall we say, on the panel. I want to ask you a Stanford-centric question, because I think this is an important one for many of the folks in the room. You have identified a very different vision of the future. All of you are consistent in expressing that idea. And all of you are also consistent in expressing a significant degree of uncertainty that the future is going to be very different. We're not exactly sure what it's going to look like. We're not exactly sure what the transition path is likely to be.
I think we differ more on the transition.
What are the research needs here? How can a research institution like Stanford help in assisting you to answer those questions?
Train more engineers. We don't need more research. We need more engineers.
One answer.
Yeah,
We're doing that, by
right.
the way.
More.
Yeah, I'm always been sort of research, development, deployment. So I think you do need more research. I think on all the kinds of things, like the deep discovery science, the moonshots, the things that help inform the nanomaterials for a fault current limiter to override faults and reactive power as we put more devices on. The way to integrate that with policy and the way that Arun is doing sort of uniquely here to be able to say, if this is a disaggregated grid of the future, how do we manage it most intelligently, where technology meets policy, meets market players? There's an unbelievably integrative role, and Dan on the finance side, you'll hear later today, on the integrative role. I'm very proud, Sally and Arun inviting me to do the Energy Technology Collaborative, where the students help push over the line community choice power for East Palo Alto and many of the communities along the peninsula, availing statutes that are recent in California law, but are enabling new model schemes for new communities to begin to have unprecedented authority on their own energy future. So this university has unbelievable capacities to on each place of that, the science, the research, the development, and the deployment, and we're seeing it with community relations right next door, and we're seeing it upstream with unbelievable material science and other research, but most of all, we're seeing it in a collaborative, integrative way. You know, I'm coming from the East Coast, collaborative, compromise, these are dirty words. You know, but here at Stanford, it is the marquee of synthesizing all of these different talents, and that's why I think you're seeing so much of this deployed here first.
Reed, do you have a perspective on that?
So I grew up on the East Coast. When I was 20 years old, my girlfriend went to Stanford and she never came back. So, so I kind of bear a grudge. So there's two things you could do. You could give me the alumni book, and the second thing you could do, is really the same thing that was done with the communications technology revolution. So item by item, thing by thing, Stanford and these environs is the geographic locus of the information age that we know today and can be in energy. And let me just commend in conclusion Steve's opening remarks. I thought they were terrific, and I also thought that the leadership that Stanford has demonstrated by showing how to do it, not just preaching it, is absolutely terrific, absolutely terrific.
All right, well, thank you all very much.
Thank
for the
you.
conversation.